So today I'm going to be talking about the most interesting and exciting field of biology. It's dynamic, it's constantly changing, and it's the source of tremendous controversies and constant debate. It is classification, taxonomy. It's the naming system that we use to organize species and to assign scientific names. Yes, I know what you're thinking. That sounds incredibly boring, but hear me out. So, why do I care about taxonomy? Why do I think that these diagrams are so incredibly interesting? Well, I'm a birder, or perhaps bird watcher to non-birders. So, when I see a new bird, I need to know what it is and how to add it to my list, because that's what birders do. We just keep long, boring spreadsheets of all the birds that we've seen, of course. But the thing is that no one can agree how to classify anything. It's just totally all over the place, with different lists based on different criteria. It's just madness. But classification is essential to organize our world. And we have to have a scientific method to organize species and to assign scientific names. The thing is that this is an essential task, but an impossible one, because nature is not neatly divided into species in a simple and easily organized way. But we need it to be. So, at this point, some of you might be thinking that you know the solution. If two individuals can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, then they're a species. If they can't, then they're not. That's the essence of something known as the biological species concept. And the thing is that it doesn't really work. And if that did work as a simple, easy, and straightforward system, there wouldn't be a huge amount to talk about here. But the thing is that different species can, and do, often interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And what about organisms that reproduce asexually, so don't interbreed at all? That includes effectively all bacteria, so the vast majority of organisms on Earth. So defining a species based on breeding that doesn't breed is fairly pointless. And even with sexually reproducing organisms, breeding experiments are rarely going to be ethical or feasible. The biological species concept is inherently flawed. Sadly, I haven't got time in this short talk to delve into the fascinating intricacies of different species concepts, and there are literally dozens of different species concepts that are defined on different criteria. And there's just so much cool stuff to talk about with taxonomy. But the thing is that all of these species concepts are, in some way, wrong. The thing is that classification and dividing organisms into species like this is not a possible thing to do. Nature is not neatly divided into species. How cool is that? We have got to define a species because all of biology, that's all of it, is based on this concept of a species, but there is no universal definition. Taxonomy is amazing. It's got another importance, though, and something that I believe really matters. So, back to birding then. I mentioned seeing a bird and not knowing how to list it because there's no universally agreed upon list, and that's a bit of an annoyance because everyone's got their own list and they don't usually match up, although I'd be lying if I said it wasn't sometimes quite a fun annoyance. But the thing is, when it comes to keeping track of biodiversity and to organizing species, what this is really important for is conservation. Wildlife conservation and protecting nature is another thing that's really important to me. That's not just because it's essential for our own survival as a species, which of course it is, because there's no way we could have usable land to grow food or breathable air or drinkable water without the biodiversity that we share our planet with. And I'll leave that as an aside because I think most people already realize the importance of biodiversity and are aware of some of the threats that face it, like climate change, wildlife trafficking, habitat destruction. Sadly, I have to add an etc. onto the end of that. But it's not just that. Conservation for the sake of conserving this incredible biodiversity is, I think, incredibly important. But what's this got to do with birding or classification or any of these diagrams? Well, the thing is that in order to conserve something, we need to know what it is. And taxonomy is effectively the cataloging system for biodiversity. And we need a consistent, well-researched, and well-informed taxonomy in order to conserve biodiversity. And laws and regulations just cannot keep up with the changes in classification. And taxonomy is inherently unstable and somewhat subjective. That's not just my opinion. The Convention on Biological Diversity, signed by the vast majority of countries, has identified what it calls the taxonomic impediment, that acknowledges the importance of taxonomy for conservation and the lack of information and research available. So examples then. As a general example, mammal taxonomists often use what is known as the phylogenetic species concept. And that is quite, as a taxonomist might say, splitty. It divides up populations so that each species represents a smaller amount of genetic diversity. Bird taxonomists, on the other hand, use a more traditional concept and something that is that's closer to the biological species concept. And some estimates have said that if bird taxonomists used the same criteria as mammalers, you might have twice as many bird species. And that's a problem, because in the US at least, roughly the same amount is spent on conservation per bird as per mammal. But if each bird represents a larger amount of genetic diversity, then that's a problem. And what about insects, which attract even less taxonomic or indeed conservation interest? And I'm simplifying here, but that's the problem. It's just too complicated, and it gets in the way of what really matters, conserving this biodiversity. When looking at a smaller scale, if one species is split into multiple new species, one species that formerly was not at risk of extinction may suddenly become multiple species that are. This happened recently with the ungulates, or hoofed mammals, and they've been undergoing lots of taxonomic reshuffling. The klipspringer, for example, is that small antelope there, and it recently went, in some publications, from 1 to 11 different species. Do we now have to consider all 11 new klipspringer species for conservation purposes? Do we need to multiply the conservation priority of klipspringers by 11 times? Well, where do we take that resources away from? We need a consistent and well-researched taxonomy to know what to prioritize with the limited conservation funds that are available. The Californian gnatcatcher is another example. That's that bird over there. And it's not a threatened species overall, but some of its subspecies are threatened. And one of those subspecies is found in an area that's very valuable to development. Some taxonomists recognize it as valid, others don't. And of course, different groups are going to use the taxonomic opinion that best supports their interest. For example, real estate developers are going to argue that it's not a valid subspecies and doesn't need protecting. This is taxonomy confusing conservation. What do? We need more research into this to know whether this subspecies is indeed valid. Taxonomy is essential for conservation. And a similar thing happens the other way too. The Florida panther, for example, is a species that is unique to its habitat. And when a species is unique to a small area, it's more likely to encourage conservation interest. And the Florida panther has become a conservation icon for its highly threatened habitat. And that's great. But some recent publications have said that it's no different to the panthers in the rest of North America and doesn't need protecting. What do? This is, again, taxonomic changes complicating conservation. And we need a consistent, well-researched, and well-informed taxonomy in order to know what to do for conservation. Then there was the recent example of orangutans. That was where a new species was formed from a split, and that seemed to make the news more. But there are innumerable examples of this, because all of conservation is based on species and based on taxonomy. Taxonomy is important, it's exciting, and it's underappreciated. Just think about it. When you look at an organism, whether it's a plant or an animal or anything else, just remember that at the most basic level, what to call it, it might be less certain than you would have thought. And that's a cool thing to think about, surely.